And I will kick our program off. Welcome everyone this evening to a special book talk for James Madison's Montpelier. My name is Emily Voss. I am the Director of Education at the Robert H. Smith Center for the Constitution. And normally I'm the host of the Constitution 101 series at Montpelier, but today Constitution 101 and our book talks have a pretty incredible crossover. I am really delighted to introduce to you this evening Jay Cost. He is the Gerald R. Ford Visiting Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. He's the author of 4 books, including James Madison, America's First Politician, which is one of our bookshop's perennial bestsellers. And he's written for numerous outlets, including the National Review, the Atlantic, and the LA Times. And he's here today to chat with us about his most recent work, which we'll get into James Madison and a little bit more about his sort of intriguing backstory and some of his political trajectory, and then some things that might kind of confuse us about Madison, because at different points in his life, he was both for and against a strong federal government, and he was for and against political parties. So we're really delighted to have Jay here with us this evening to help us sort through the problem of James Madison. And throughout the evening, we will be happy to take your questions. I would recommend that you please use the chat feature or the Q&A feature if you have a question, and I will be happy to pass those along at the appropriate time in our program. So with that, Jay, let me please hand things over to you, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Well, thank you, Emily, for that very kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here, I guess, virtually here. It's really a pleasure to be invited by Montpelier. And I just want to say, too, that it's amazing the work that you have done at Madison's Homestead. As somebody who cherishes the memory of James Madison, it's really remarkable thing that you've done to preserve his life and his legacy. And I know how hard it was. I know how difficult pain made that whole thing for you guys. So I really admire your excellent work. And thank you all for joining. I appreciate it. I hope you find this talk useful and enlightening. And it's a little intimidating for me because you're all, Emily was telling me you're all regulars for the Montpelier book talk. So I feel like I have to bring my A game tonight. But I think I'm up for it. So I think the first thing, probably for an audience like this that is well read about the founding, and I'm guessing about Madison now as well, your first question is, my goodness, another James Madison book? Was there like one every 3 months or something at this point? I have an answer for that, because the only way I was going to get this book published in the first place was if I offered my publisher an answer. But Madison is going through, I think, a bit of a revival, which I think is a good thing. I think that Madison, probably similar to Hamilton, is not been given the attention that he deserves, and until very recently, I think that he was sort of seen as being a little more than Jefferson's side man or wingman. And I think it's good that people are thinking about Madison and looking at Madison. But I have noticed that even in this sort of Madisonian revival, there still remains this kind of 2 separate baskets of Madisonian scholarship. There's sort of political science, political theory types who focus very intently on that really crucial period in his history in the 1780s, when he's writing the Federalist, and people who are looking at his constitutional thinking. And then there are the more, I don't want to say shallow, but it's not as theory-laden biographies. There are that sort of look at his entire history. And I think oftentimes those 2 groups are not well reconciled with each other. And a lot of times the people who look very intently at Madison's political theory have trouble understanding why he did or what did he do for the remainder of his career. And that, as Emily mentioned, the seeming flip-flops through his career. There's not a lot of the people who really focus on Madison's thinking are often puzzled by the rest of his biography. And I don't think biographers look deeply at his political theory to really explain those. So that's where I thought this biography could actually serve a need. And so the basic idea of my book is sort of hinted at in the subtitle, James Madison, America's First Politician. I don't mean that literally. I mean, pretty close to literally, um, in that he was really one of the first people in America who could dedicate his life professionally to politics. I mean, if you think about somebody like George Washington, or you think about somebody like Thomas Jefferson, or say an Easterner like Robert Morris or Gouverneur Morris, all of these men were simultaneously engaging in political activity while maintaining business interests. And, I mean, a business interest like Mount Vernon was a enormous commitment. And Jefferson particularly was always like, oh, I need to go home and I need to quit doing this and I need to focus on Monticello. Madison really wasn't that way, in, at least not until the 1790s. He was able to dedicate himself full time to politics in ways that others couldn't, which I think is one reason why he was able to move up so quickly through the political ranks, because he was available and he was able to be sort of helpful and useful. But he also, I think this serves a need, because this is a country that is growing in size and has enormous political problems, and we need a full-time class of politicians. So in that sense, he sort of was the first politician, or at least one of them. But in the larger sense in which I mean it, what I mean in the argument of my book is that James Madison was the person who put together a blueprint for how American politics is supposed to function. And in particular, how American politics can serve the interests of society, what politics can. And in particular, what do I mean by that? Well, Madison's theory in the Federalist Papers, like Federalist 10, Federalist 51, Madison has this idea that politics, well organized, can prevent any one faction in society from dominating the rest and creating injustice. I mean, that's Madison's notion of the extended republic, is that if the larger the scope of society, the more interest that it takes in, the less likely any group or faction is to dominate. So what that means for Madison is that if nobody dominates, then factions have to bargain with each other. And in the process of bargaining, which is what politics for him really is about, consensus will emerge. Hopefully consensus will emerge. And the final result will be something that, if it's nobody's first choice, at least everybody can walk away reasonably happy. That was Madison's idea of politics. And it's what's so interesting about him, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment, is sort of a downstream of his education at Princeton at the College of New Jersey. But what makes it so interesting about him is that it distinguishes him from Jefferson on one hand and from Hamilton on the other. And Jefferson sort of had faith in the potential of almost mass participatory democracy, right? That Jefferson believed that with proper education, he was a big advocate for education, that people could govern themselves. So Jefferson, in a way, I don't want to say he had faith in the masses, but something approaching faith in the masses. Hamilton, on the other hand, really had more faith in elites or natural aristocrats, which for Hamilton in practice often meant people who had gotten wealthy. Hamilton believed that they were the ones who had that sort of exemplary virtue and character to sort of lift themselves up from outside of factions and be the great men of politics. So like somebody like George Washington for Hamilton. So Jefferson has faith in the masses, Hamilton in the elites. Madison really doesn't have faith in anybody. He's very pessimistic. His political theory is very pessimistic in a way. He doesn't really ascribe, even the elites. I think he's worried about the elites. He's worried about the aristocrats. He's worried about the commoners. He's worried about the poor. There's this interesting sort of twist in his political theory, which is, one would think, well, if you're that pessimistic, then maybe politics isn't the right field for you, Mr. Madison. But he has this sort of optimistic kind of twist where, if we put everybody together into a well-functioning political process, we don't need people to behave with a special kind of virtue. Because what will happen instead is that one group is going to try and do something selfish, and another group will block their selfish behavior. And the another group will block their behavior and their behavior. And then, but the things that nobody objects to are going to be things that are reasonably satisfactory for the good of the country. And so what Madison is talking about, really, I think in Federalist 10, is what he's talking about is politics. It's what he's talking about in Federalist 51 as well. what he's talking about is well-organized politics can make sure that the government engages its business on behalf of the country as a whole without violating the rights of individuals. So that's one way in which I would say Madison is America's first politician, is that he has a vision of politics, that of politics is being something that is about fairness, and about the discovery of fair compromises that I think really makes him unique among the founders. But then the other thing, sort of like I said, sort of moving beyond his biography, or excuse me, moving beyond his political theory and looking more carefully at his biography, I really think that his life in the public arena reflects these commitments to compromise and to, importantly for Madison, political solutions or policy solutions that don't play favorites, because ultimately I think that was Madison's sine qua non in politics, is that he believed that government should act like a neutral umpire. That's a phrase he uses in a letter to George Washington shortly before the Constitutional Convention begins. He says, what we really need is some way to make the government act like a neutral umpire, right? Not playing favorites among factions. And his political philosophy, I think, is a way for that to happen. A robust political debate can serve effectively as an umpire. But what's interesting about Madison is that he often, in the political process, placed himself in the role of umpire. And I think this is something that you see again and again and again. And I think when you see his life in politics through that lens, a lot of the seeming contradictions sort of wash away. Not all of them, but some of them. So I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean here. First thing I'd like to do is talk a little bit, thinking about his biography. One of the things that I think is really important for us to appreciate with respect to Madison is that he went to the College of New Jersey. He did not go to William and Mary. I think this is one of the most significant yet underappreciated aspects of his political career. He had good reasons for doing that. We're not sure exactly what they were. There was worries about his health and the climate, and the thinking that the kind of swampy climate of the Virginia Tidewater would be bad for his health. But he had also one of his tutors had gone to had gone to the College of New Jersey, and the College of New Jersey was on an upswing in terms of its reputation, because shortly, a couple of years before Madison arrives, it gets taken over by John Witherspoon, who is a Scottish minister, ends up participating as one of really the great unsung founders of the American Revolution. And Witherspoon really kind of hates the program that he discovers and just redesigns it. And Madison gets this really extraordinary education that we would say is the true classical humanist education, sort of kind of education that they had developed during the Renaissance even. And what's interesting is that it's where Madison's sort of pessimism about human nature kind of comes through. Madison was not, during his adulthood, he was not an especially religious person. His letters don't have a lot of religious sentiments. His younger letters do, which I think might be an illustration of the kind of education that he got at Princeton, because Witherspoon was a Whiggish Presbyterian. So what do I mean by that? Well, he was devout. The Presbyterians at this point took their Calvinism more seriously than the Anglicans of William and Mary did. Witherspoon took his Calvinism seriously, but he was a Whig in the sense that he was prepared and interested in challenging the established order. And I think this does a couple things for Madison. One of the things is I think it just gives him a reformist bent. He's not inclined to take the status quo as it is and say, well, this is the way it's been, so we should just leave it as it is. I think he really, from Witherspoon and from his experience in Princeton, really begins to develop not only an instinct to question the received wisdom, but really analytical tools to do so in a very precise way. I think another thing that really develops at Princeton for Madison is a kind of Calvinism, or a kind of pessimism, I should say, about human nature. You know, a Calvinist sort of doctrine or theology is, a little on the grim side for those of you who aren't familiar with it. It's basically the belief that human beings, is a Christian Protestant theology, and basically the idea is that human beings are so mired in the muck of sin that they cannot even ask God for salvation, that God actually has to give them the grace to make them even aware of how horrible their moral condition is. This is where the doctrine of predestination comes in, that God and his divine sovereignty and inscrutable wisdom has elected some people to be saved, and has, for reasons that are unknown to us, allowed other people not to be saved. That's not really something, as a theological doctrine, is not something that influences Madison over the course of his life, at least so far as I was able to tell in my research. But this kind of pessimism about human nature, I think, really shines through in his political thinking, that he's not counting on the virtue of a certain group of people to save small r Republican politics. That what instead we have to take human beings as they are, and rather than as we'd like them to be, right? Madison's famous line from Federalist 51, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. He really meant that. That wasn't just a throwaway elocution from him. I think it reflects that kind of profound education that he got at Princeton. And I think it ends up really enforcing in his mind over the course of his life the importance of the political process, because we can't count on human virtue, I should say. It's nice when human beings are virtuous, but it's not something that we can depend on. It's also something that he points out in the Federalist, right? And I think that this basic idea ends up influencing an enormous number of events in his life. And I'll just sort of go through some of these in chronological order, and I'm trying to sort of emphasize, not so much look at the period of the Constitutional Convention, because that story has been told. I mean, he told it, right? I mean, any sort of narrative you read about the Constitutional Convention is ultimately just a reworking of Madison's notes. So, and it's been told time and time and again for, almost 200 years at this point. But I think one of the first things to look at is his fight for religious liberty in the Commonwealth of Virginia. So Virginia at this point, when he has an established church, the Church of Virginia, which is an Anglican church, and had been not as oppressive of religious minorities as the Puritan Church in Massachusetts, for instance, but had oppressed the Baptists. And also the Anglican Church in Virginia really sort of is sitting, or is overlapped with, kind of the class divisions of the state by the time the state declares independence. So it's really the church of the Tidewater aristocratic elite of Virginia. But as you move westward toward the Piedmont, you're going to run into more Presbyterians, and you're going to certainly begin to run into Baptists who are not members of the Anglican Church, and even will face persecution. Now, Madison grows up an Anglican. He's an Anglican by birth. But, and this is what's so interesting, is even at a young age, at the age of 25, he goes to the Virginia Constitutional Convention and tries to disestablish the Church of Virginia, which is his family's church. And his argument is basically that government should not be playing favorites among religious denominations. And the context there is that George Mason is at this point, so it's 1776, Madison's 25. He's basically a nobody. He gets the job at Virginia's convention mainly because his name is James Madison Jr., and he's the son of his father, who is the most sort of the wealthiest landowner in Orange County. So Madison gets to go to this. And at this, you have Edmund Pendleton, you have Patrick Henry, you have George Mason, you have these titans of Virginia revolutionary politics. And George Mason writes the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which is very influential in Thomas Jefferson. And the last of the declarations, it's a 14-point sort of declaration. The last one calls for toleration of minority groups, religious minority groups. Madison proposes a change to this, And instead of toleration, he proposes disestablishment. So what's the difference between the two? Toleration, Mason's idea was that the Anglican Church would continue to be the official church of Virginia, so it would continue to get state support. But if you were a Baptist and you wanted to go to your own church, that was fine. If you were a Quaker, that's fine too. Madison says, no, the government has to get out of the business of sponsoring religion altogether. And his argument is, it's fascinating for us as such a young man, how much it is a prelude to Federalist 10, right? Basically, Madison's idea here is that the government should not be playing favorites with respect to religion, even at the age of 25. Well, Madison's program doesn't pass. His cousin Edmund Pendleton objects to it. And Edmund Pendleton usually got his way when he wanted something, but the tide was sort of against that old conservative kind of aristocratic ethos. You flash forward ahead a couple of years, back up to 1784. Madison has already been serving in Congress at this point for 3 years, in the Continental Congress, I should say. He comes back home to the House of Delegates for a stint in the House of Delegates. It's an interesting point in his life, too, because, you know, Jefferson is pestering, oh, you need to get some land and come down here and live with me in Monroe and we can all be buddies and gentlemen farmers together. And Madison's like, no, I don't have, he doesn't have any money, frankly. He doesn't have any money. Thinks about going and studying the law, but his heart's not in it. And even though that would provide him with an independent education, there's just something about the action of politics. He can't get away from the action of politics. So he goes to the House of Delegates, and there in the House of Delegates, Patrick Henry is, as he often was causing trouble. And the trouble that Henry was looking to cause at that point was, well, you know, we need to get back into the business of supporting religion. That the government had effectively sort of moved away from supporting religion at that point. Virginia had defunded the Anglican Church at that point. But Henry's attitude is, we need a tax to support any church that might need supporting, because the morals of the state have sunk to a precarious level. And so therefore what we need to do is we need to get a tax to any church. Madison thinks this is a terrible idea, and his battle, and one of the reasons I really like James Madison, by the way, one of the reasons he's one of my favorite founders, is because you never see him coming. And you would think that in a battle between Patrick Henry, the great give me liberty, give me death character, that a small, sickly, soft-spoken nerd, frankly, like James Madison would lose to Patrick Henry. But in fact, he defeats Patrick Henry time and time again. It's just this really extraordinary thing. And Pat Henry hates him by the time he dies. He can't stand him, Madison, which I think is very funny as well. Anyway, Madison stalls for time in the Virginia House of Delegates and sort of uses that kind of like, you know, like a Mitch McConnell or Chuck Schumer kind of using the rules against Patrick Henry. Suspends the third reading of the bill before the House goes on recess. And during the recess, he writes really his first great political pamphlet, the Memorial and Remonstrance against Religious Assessments. And what he does is it's sort of a kitchen sink type of pamphlet, because he's trying to build a political coalition against Henry's plan, and particularly trying to get the Presbyterians against it. He succeeds. But you know, one of the really interesting things about this is his argument there again gets to this idea that the government shouldn't play favorites. But it anticipates Federalist 10 as well, because, you know, in Federalist 10, Madison talks about all the sources of factional conflict in society. He talks about economic differences. He talks about geographical differences. He talks about religious differences, is that religious differences are often a source of factional conflict. He mentions that just offhand in Federalist 10, but in the Memorial and Remonstrance, he goes into more detail about this and says, look, you know, there are going to be factions arising over religion. And if the control of the government is a prize for religious factions to grasp, that is a recipe for civil war, civil unrest, and bloodshed on unimaginable proportions. I mean, this is sort of his argument. He makes this great point that, you know, the established Christian church had been a source of terrible religious strife in Europe in the past, by that point, 250 years. And it had been a source of corruption within both the government and the clergy, and that the fair thing to do is for the government to get out of the business of religion altogether, because the government shouldn't be playing favorites. I mean, at the end of the day, that's the cornerstone of his argument. So that's one example, I think, really of Madison's commitment to fair play. Another one comes up with the Bill of Rights, and the story of the Bill of Rights. So let's flash forward ahead a couple years. The story of the Bill of Rights itself is a remarkable story because Madison wasn't really much of a believer in the Bill of Rights. And this is something, the Bill of Rights was George Mason's real, that was what Mason wanted. And Mason, the summer that Madison is writing the Bill of Rights, Mason is at his estate complaining to his brother of the absurdity of James Madison favoring the Bill of Rights. And it just goes to show what a clever, crafty politician Madison was, because he kind of was a flip-flopper. So those of you who remember back in the 2004 presidential election, John Kerry was accused by George Bush of being a flip-flopper. Well, Madison was kind of a flip-flopper. He was against a Bill of Rights, and then he was for a Bill of Rights. He didn't really change his mind. It's just that Henry had called for a Bill of Rights, but Madison understood intuitively that what Henry was looking to do was to try to kill the Constitution by demanding another convention that included a Bill of Rights. Well, after Virginia ratified, that problem disappears. And so he thinks, well, Bill of Rights, he doesn't think it's going to do a lot of good because, frankly, in his view, if the people want to trample on individual liberties, they'll manage to do that. The best way to protect liberty for Madison is a well-ordered political process. But his feeling is that if a Bill of Rights is well written, it can't do very much harm. It's really interesting about the Bill of Rights, though, is Madison's original draft of the Bill of Rights actually includes an explicit injunction on the states, that the states are not allowed to do what? They're not allowed to infringe on the rights of conscience for citizens, and also their right to due process and their right to a trial by jury, which is an interesting, that is proposed in the House. I think it gets killed in the Senate. It's not part of the package of amendments that gets sent off. But what is Madison doing there? Madison is, again, this is another way, it's a sneaky thing for him too, because he had been looking in the Constitutional Convention for ways to really hamstring the states. He had wanted Congress to have a veto over state legislation. He loses that battle. He doesn't even get Gouverneur Morris, of all people, to support him on that. But this is sort of his second stab at that, is to sort of hamstring the states. And it gets to why are the states such a problem in Madison's view? And it's because their political, for lack of a better word, the political society of the 13 states was too small. It was too narrow. It wasn't diverse enough. And it therefore, in the state political systems, you could have single factions of society control the entire thing. You see this, for instance, this is a big source of religious persecution in Virginia because the Anglicans dominated the state up until only a few years before the events of the 1780s. Certainly a cause of distress in Rhode Island because the faction of indebted farmers control the entire state. It's a problem in Massachusetts as well. The creditors of Boston control the entire state. This leads to Shays' Rebellion. Madison is worried about the state governments because of the potential for factions to amount to a numerical majority. And when they're able to do that, his worry then is individual rights are going to be trampled. And so what's he trying to do in the Bill of Rights? Well, one thing he's trying to do is hamstring the states with this proposed amendment. But, you know, another thing, today, when we look at the Bill of Rights today, we know that the Bill of Rights enjoins not just the federal government, but also the state governments. But that wasn't the way it was originally interpreted. John Marshall, the Supreme Court Marshall is a Federalist, says, no, the Bill of Rights only enjoins the federal government. It's only after the 14th Amendment's due process clause, the Supreme Court takes another look at the Bill of Rights in light of the 14th Amendment saying the states have to respect the due process of their citizens. Said, well, that basically means that the Bill of Rights applies to the states. But if you look at the way Madison words, because he ends up wording these, the only amendment that explicitly enjoins the state is the First Amendment. In the other amendments, he's actually using the passive voice. And it sort of speaks, by the way, to the power that John Marshall has managed to acquire for himself, sitting on the Supreme Court, basically sort of throwing out that passive voice, or I don't want ignoring the passive voice, but it's only the First Amendment. It says Congress shall make no law. The Second Amendment, for instance, says the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Madison's using the passive voice there. It speaks, I think, to his continued anxiety about the states as bad actors. So that's a sort of another sort of less than often commented upon sort of element of Madison's political career. I want to talk just very briefly because it was the subject of my previous book. So this here is my current book, and this over here is my last book. My previous book was about his battle with Alexander Hamilton. And, you know, I really think Madison has come in for a lot of unfair criticism for his opposition to Hamilton. And the thinking was that, oh, well, he was in favor of big government and then he was opposed to big government. He favored it with Hamilton at the convention, but then, you know, the story is Jefferson comes back in town and Jefferson works his magic on Madison. It's that old sort of idea of, you know, Madison being a little more than assistant to Jefferson. I don't think that's true at all. The timeline doesn't match up because Madison is in the political thick of things in the winter of 1790, fighting Hamilton on the debt plan, even before Jefferson shows up into town. And I think the best way to understand Madison's opposition to Hamilton is their visions of government. So, like I said, Madison viewed, as he said to George Washington, government has to be a neutral umpire. Hamilton, if I could carry Madison's analogy a little bit, Hamilton sort of saw government as a manager. So think of a baseball team in a baseball game, right? The umpire is supposed to call the balls and strikes, regardless of whether or not it's the best player on the team or the worst player on the team, right? That's the job of an umpire, to be fair to the rules. The job of a manager is to put certain players in, take certain players out, move these guys around. You go here for the good of the whole team. That was sort of, if you look at Hamilton's economic agenda in the 1790s, that's really what he's doing. He's favoring I don't want to say he's favoring the wealthy because he's favoring a particular type of wealth. He's favoring those who own liquid wealth, particularly government debt certificates, bills of sale, things like this, as opposed to the tidewater planters whose wealth is tied up in land. Hamilton is favoring those who own paper wealth. And for Madison, it's a very, very one-sided, objectionably one-sided. The benefits in Hamilton's system tend to rain down in just one direction. But there's something else that's going on in his disagreement with Hamilton, and it is Hamilton's vision of government. And I mentioned this at the top of our discussion in Hamilton's view of the capacity of elites and sort of natural aristocrats to govern. One of the parts of that that's downstream in Hamilton's system is what we would today probably call corruption, but Hamilton would call patronage. So Hamilton, for instance, Hamilton, I don't want to criticize Hamilton per se, because Hamilton is expressing a view that it was expressed by David Hume, right? Like Hume was looking at the English government in the early 1700s after the power of the crown had been reduced in the wake of the Glorious Revolution. It still seemed that the crown was able to get its way in Parliament. And this was a source of dispute among British political thinkers. And Hume pointed out, well, you know, one of the reasons the king's able to get his way so often is he can effectively bribe members of parliament. He can offer a military appointment, he can offer a peerage, anything like that. The king has all sorts of goodies that he can dispense. And Hume's attitude was, thank goodness that he does. And Hamilton has a similar attitude. There's actually debate at the Constitutional Convention about whether and when members of Congress could take executive offices. And Hamilton says we should let them. It's a good thing that they need to be bribed, because if they're not bribed, they won't do what's good for the country. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly for effect here, but not as much as you'd think, by the way. Hamilton was pretty unabashed about this. And Hamilton uses, to some extent, or maybe the better way to put it is he allows his financial system to be used as a form of patronage. And probably the self-interest of members of Congress is the decisive factor in the debt assumption plan, which was the plan for the federal government to assume the debts of the states. And one of the things that often gets overlooked in Madison's history is how angry he was about that. He was very mad. A lot of times we think that the real fight with Hamilton starts with the Bank of the United States, and no doubt that's part of it. But it was really the debt assumption plan that had him seeing red. And even at the end of it, he manages to negotiate a pretty fair deal for Virginia. He writes a letter to his father saying that as a practical matter, it's not a problem, but he is still angry. And he is angry, and Jefferson is angry later on. And because they're doing the math, the vote on the debt assumption plan was so narrow that Hamilton's patronage probably made a difference, a bit of a difference. It made the difference between victory and defeat. And for Madison, that violates his sense of how politics is supposed to happen. The way for compromises that benefit the country to work, you have to have members of Congress representing the interests of their constituents. And Madison's argument, and I don't think he was wrong about this, is that a lot of members of Congress on that plan were voting the way they voted because it was good for their own pocketbooks rather than good for the country as a whole. And this is the origins, by the way, of the first political party. So as Emily noted at the beginning of the talk, that Madison seemed to flip-flop on political parties. But what was this party? Well, first of all, he called it the Republican Party. It was not known as the Democratic Republican Party. In his essays for the National Gazette, which was a newspaper that began its publication run in 1791, he talks about the two parties in America. He doesn't talk about we know the parties today as the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. That's not what he calls them. He calls one the Republican Party. He calls the other the Anti-Republican Party. And what he sees the Republican Party as doing is sort of being the party of all of the people who are committed to a certain style of politics, who believe that the government should represent the interests of the people. I mean, that's why they chose the word Republican. It's unfortunate in some respects because the word Republican now is entangled with our own partisanship. So we need to put that aside to understand why would he choose the name that he did. It's similar to like why in the 1830s do they choose the name the Whigs? It's a way to indicate their view of Andrew Jackson as a would-be tyrant, similar to James II, right? The choice is a significant one, right? And so, and in one of his essays, Madison encourages, people to banish all the distinctions of class and region and economic divisions and recognize the threat that Hamiltonian style elitism is posing to the country. That's sort of how he sees his parties, how Jefferson sees it. And it also explains, I think, in many ways, why after they get in control of the government, they let this party organization basically fall apart. So that by the time Madison leaves office in 1817, there really is no Republican Party or Federalist Party. We have this brief period where there's really not much party politics at all. It wasn't really until Martin Van Buren in the 1820s that we begin to see a party as a regular permanent feature of American politics. For Madison, it was more about sounding the alarm. That was the job of the Republican Party, sounding the alarm to the people of the threat of this system of government, this Hamiltonian elitism. It's also not coincidental that one of the first things that he and Jefferson do is form a newspaper. I mean, that's how you get the word out in 1791. Nowadays you go on social media. In 1791, you go on, you do a newspaper. So I think a lot of Madison's flip-flops with Hamilton don't hold as much water when you look at them closely. I think the last thing I want to talk about too is something that's often not discussed is Madison's time after the War of 1812. And one of the arguments I make in the book is I really think Madison is an underrated president. I think that his efforts during the War of 1812 don't get the proper appreciation for what he didn't do. The War of 1812 was enormously unpopular in New England. And this is not the first time there has been a war that has been enormously unpopular. In fact, 100 years later, there is a war that's enormously unpopular with a faction of the country, and that's World War I. And what did Woodrow Wilson do during World War I? He suppresses public opinion, right? There's, he throws Eugene Debs in jail. Debs was his opponent in the 1912 presidential election. Debs is thrown in jail, and it's not till Harding, of all people, go figure, finally pardons Debs. I mean, my goodness, right? Lincoln, even the great, Lincoln, the savior of the country, violates civil rights to wage an unpopular war. But Madison doesn't do anything like that. there is a Sedition Act of 1917, but there is no Sedition Act of 1814. And, when Madison was the Hartford Convention, which is this sort of faction of New England Federalists that meet, and Madison does not send the army up to Hartford to break the Hartford Convention up. He just waits in Washington to see what they're going to do. It's really an extraordinary thing. I don't think he gets the credit for his respect for civil rights, which I think illustrates his commitment to the idea of politics, right? That disagreement with the war. I mean, Madison had nasty things to say and ungenerous things to say about those who didn't want the war. But he didn't suppress it, which I think says something about his commitment to politics and the necessity of politics for good government. But after the war, what Madison does in the 15th Congress, really one of the most extraordinary Congresses of the 19th century, he and a bunch of other people, Albert Gallatin's in the mix, his Treasury Secretary Dallas, John C. Calhoun when he's still in his nationalist phase, Henry Clay, of course, the great, wonderful Henry Clay. I always say Henry Clay is the greatest American ever to become president. I'm a big Henry Clay fan. But what they do is they put together an economic program. It's easy to criticize it as just warmed over Hamiltonianism, right? Because what does it have? It has protection for industry. Hamilton wanted that. It has a national bank. Hamilton wanted that. Calls for internal improvements. Hamilton wanted that. And you just say, well, this is just Madison admitting Hamilton was right all along. On the economics, yes, but there's an extraordinary difference between Hamilton's program and the program they put together in 1815, 1816. Hamilton's program, as I mentioned, was really one-sided. The benefits tended to fall on just the creditors. But if you look at the economic policies that they put together in that 15th Congress, there is real balance. The Second Bank of the United States is a good example. I think I'll just close here is the difference between the first bank and the second bank. You can appreciate this, is that Hamilton did not want bank branches. He wanted the bank to stay in Philadelphia so it could keep a close eye on it. But Madison and Gallatin wanted the bank to have multiple branches spread throughout the country. And so by 1819, I think the second bank has something like 24 branches spread, maybe not 24, but more than 12 branches. And why does that matter? Well, it matters because, New England and the mid-Atlantic have good banking systems, but in places like the West and the South, there are no good banking systems. So the bank actually becomes a more balanced institution in the second bank. And it's interesting as well. We usually think of Jackson's veto of the Second Bank of the United States in 1832 as a way to stand up for the farmers of the South and the West. But it was actually the representatives of Congress from the South and the West who were the biggest supporters of rechartering the bank. People who really wanted the bank to disappear were the New Yorkers, because Wall Street wanted the financial power that the bank had locked into Philadelphia. They want that power in New York, right? That's a little off into the future. But I think it speaks to, there's Hamilton's economic policies were financially brilliant, but their one-sidedness leads to this big political, catastrophe in the 1790s. But Madison sort of alters the politics, spreads the benefits around, such that by the time he retires, we have this remarkable period in American history. We call it the era of good feelings. Monroe just sort of falls accidentally into it, but I really would suggest that in many ways, it's a product of Madisonian balance, that the country had reached a kind of equilibrium, and the kind of factional disputes that had beset the country for so long had seemed to sort of disappear. And I think it's a testament to Madison's vision of politics and how he was actually a good practitioner of it. So I think just sort of as an overview for you, and I wanted to sort of focus on some sort of the byways of Madison's political life rather than the main sort of interstate of like Federalist tenant stuff. But so that's what I had for you today. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions if you have one, if you have any.
Yes, we do have some questions. So, and I'll maybe try to take these in kind of maybe a chronological type order. So early on in your talk, you mentioned that, one of the things that Madison maybe sponged up when he was at the College of New Jersey was this perhaps pessimistic idea of human nature. And then it's very interesting because his sense of trusting the representatives to represent the interest of their constituents rather than represent their own personal interest is to some extent faith in their human nature. So just kind of curious if you had any thoughts on how his process shifted.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that is one of the areas in which the party was supposed to function. And the original Madisonian vision of the party. If you think about the earliest party, what did it do? There were a couple things that the party emphasized. The first was the newspaper. So that was a way to get the message out. But then another thing they end up doing as well, and it's something that frankly is a power we've taken away from our modern political parties, it's the power of nominations. And you think about, well, what is a nomination supposed to do? I mean, in the earliest instances, the nominations for the party were the established men of the state, the established leaders of the party, basically saying, this is a guy you can trust. So even then, Madison's not interested in a hurly-burly sort of process of, just letting anybody take the name in the word Republican, right? So the party is a way to sort of make sure that members of Congress are actually following through on their promises to their constituents. It's a way to maintain accountability to them. So that would be one way that they do that, I would say. But it ends up being a problem. And I think Madison is really surprised. And he's really caught off guard in 1790 at Hamilton's ingenuity. I don't think he was surprised at Hamilton's industriousness, because anybody who knew anything about Hamilton knew that the man was just a font of seemingly endless effort and willpower. But I think he was surprised at how Hamilton was able to create the architecture that he created as quickly as he did. And I don't think he was expecting that. And I particularly think he was not expecting the executive branch to become the center of governing agency. And I think that really bothered him.
Thank you. All right. So next question, we'll move to the Constitutional Convention. And the Constitutional Convention is characterized by a number of compromises. One of the perhaps most famous being the 3/5 compromise. Mm-hmm. So we have a question from a teacher, which I love questions from teachers. And he is asking why the convention goers, the framers, did not make a stronger stance against slavery. And to use perhaps modern students' language, do you think that Madison and the other founders who were slaveholders are perhaps on a trajectory to get canceled?
Well, I hope not. I mean, I think that we need to take these men as they are. And I think, when we talk about canceling people nowadays, and particularly taking down statues and I think maybe this is an overcorrection of an error that we've made, where I think that we have a reverence for the founders, whereas what we should be shooting for is esteem. We turn them into demigods almost through our statues and the sort of typical childhood school narrative that many of us were taught. They were larger than life. And then when we realized that they weren't, that they were full of faults, I think let's get rid of them altogether. Well, we shouldn't have built them up so much in the first place, I think. And I think there's a difference between reverence, which is, to hold somebody in sort of almost a kind of godlike worshipfulness, and esteem, which is a respect and an admiration for the good things that they did, but not looking the other way at their mistakes. And I will say that with Madison's silence during the debate over the 3/5 clause is one of the lowest moments of his political career, because the 3/5 clause goes directly against his system of government, right? His system of government holds that the way Republican government, good government, can be maintained is through an open process of multiple factions. What does the 3/5 clause do? The 3/5 clause amplifies the voice of one faction, those of the slave-holding agricultural aristocracy, at the expense of the others. And the only person at the convention who's really prepared to raise a stink over this is Gouverneur Morris, right? Madison is quiet. And I think that that speaks to his failures on slavery, and I think that which are significant. I think that Madison, like many men of the Revolutionary age, understood that slavery was wrong on an intellectual level, but I don't see a lot of evidence that he ever felt it in his heart. Jefferson felt it in his heart, which is it's ironic because since we have proof of his relationship with Sally Hemings. Jefferson has come in for more condemnation than Madison, but Jefferson was racked with guilt over slavery. I don't think Madison was. I don't think Madison ever really lost sleep over the issue of slavery, even though he understood it was wrong. And I think one of the, when I teach my students, because I teach high school is one of the things that I do. One of the things that I do with my students is I sort of suggest to them that in the 1780s, there is a broad North-South consensus on slavery, at least among the political elites. They weren't fools. They weren't idiots. They understood, most of them understood the contradiction between all men are created equal and the permanent heritable fact of chattel slavery in the South. They understood that contradiction. And they knew slavery was wrong, but they weren't prepared to do anything about it. This is a view that, and you see that this is sort of the basis of compromise at the Constitutional Convention. Okay, so you see one of the biggest critics of slavery at the Constitutional Convention is George Mason. All right, Mason is also one of the largest slaveholders in Virginia, but he calls slavery the curse of heaven. Right. Meanwhile, though, the most democratic member of the Constitution is James Wilson, who himself at various points owned slaves. And when they're debating this 3/5 clause, Wilson gives this really remarkable speech that's not remarkable for its virtue, but remarkable for how it illustrates this kind of unvirtuous consensus, where Wilson goes on and on about the evils of slavery and how this, giving a bonus to slaveholders is unfair. Yada, 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 but let's not break the Union up over it. In other words, we in the North are not prepared to lose sleep over this either. The only one who suggests maybe we should take a friendly leave of each other is Gouverneur Morris, which I think vindicates him as probably, morally speaking, the most far-sighted man at the convention, and somebody who I think really deserves more acclaim than he's gotten. And I think that that's why in 1787 they were able to come to a deal, but in the 1850s they no longer could, because in 1787 the North and the South they thought slavery was icky, but not so icky that we're going to do something about it. By the 1850s you have a large and growing faction in the North that includes not only the abolitionists but the FreeSoilers, who decided, no, slavery is evil and we need to do something about it. Now, what that something is abolition, is it free soil? Regardless, you have a majority in the North by 1860 ready to embrace free soil. The South, on the other hand, is now moved to the position where no, slavery is a positive good. So whereas public opinion among elites in the 1870s was in the sort of morally, icky kind of middle ground, by the 1850s, we've moved into these two poles. And I think that explains a lot of the difference.
Thank you. And I hope that's a good setup for our teachers' discussion of the Constitutional Convention, because, you can spend an entire semester just on the convention. Mm-hmm. So, well, moving slightly beyond that, we have the addition of Dolly Payne Todd to James Madison's life, and she, ends up not just being a personal companion, but also to some extent a political asset. So we have a question: what were the most significant manners in which Dolly Madison impacted the practical application of Madison's earlier political theory?
Oh, that's a great question. I love Dolly Madison. She is awesome. Even like just coming through the pages of history, she is amazing. Her personality is just, the only word that I can sort of use to describe her that I think fits is just sparkling. Everything about her, she just had a sparkle, a luster to her. But she was a really smart politician. And one of the things that she did, I don't know the extent to which she amplified Madison's political vision, but she certainly helped him get elected president. Is that, Washington, D.C. nowadays, Washington, D.C. is a nice place to go. There's nice restaurants, you got sports, you got shows. In the early 1800s, it was awful. It was an awful place to be. It was there was nothing there, really. Georgetown was just a tiny, sleepy little village. You had these boarding houses where congressmen would sit around talking about politics all day and grumbling, and it was not pleasant. And Thomas Jefferson was in the White House, but he was a terrible host. He didn't like to throw parties. He liked small, intimate dinners with members of Congress. Dolly was the great hostess of early Washington, D.C. Dolly would throw fantastic parties that got people together, and people would actually have fun. And it wouldn't just be men grumbling about politics. There'd be ladies there as well, and the conversation would be looser. And even when Madison was president, when Washington and Adams would host parties, but these were these horrible, stiff, formal affairs, like almost like you're going to meet the Queen of England today. Like everybody's all nervous and, oh, here comes the president. I better, But at the Madison parties, it was fun, and it was good for James Madison because he could relax. But the really interesting thing about this politically is that Dolly was able to use this to win over members of Congress for her husband's political ambitions. And this was important because Madison leaves Congress in 1797 and never to return. And he's running for president in 1808. So he doesn't have the kind of insider contacts that he had possessed 10 years ago. And also, this is an age before you can openly run for president. So how do we solve this problem? Well, we use Dolly. Dolly would invite members of Congress over for parties, and their wives as well, which was important. And he would win them over to Madison's cause. I mean, there's a great story. I can't remember the congressman she was trying to work on Madison's behalf. He's a great opponent of card games, and Dolly was a big fan of card games. And Dolly, for like a period of time in the 1808 campaign and the lead up to it, put away all the card games. And their opponent, Pinckney, in the election of 1808, I think it's Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. I get my Pinckneys confused. I'm pretty sure it's
all
Charles
do.
Yeah, right. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney said, if I had just been running against James Madison, I might have won. But I had to run against James and Dolly, and I didn't stand a chance. And I think Dolly was a real expert in what we might call the soft power of politics, and how politics is not just about argumentation, and it's not a forensic contest, but it's about, winning people over. And she was really good for him too, that he was, I think, Theodoric Bland's wife in the 1780s at the Continental Congress said Madison at parties was a stiff, gloomy creature, is what she called him. Like he was a stick in the mud. But he's married to Dolly, and by the time he's president, he has a reputation for being quite the dancer. So it speaks to not just Dolly's personal effect on him, but also her effect on his political career as well. Which is really remarkable. Really, another one of those characters from the early American period who doesn't get the credit that she deserves, I think.
I'll have to do another one of these focused on Dolly's
Dolly.
biographers. Again, once we're moving slightly into, this is Madison as Secretary of State, but you brought up John Marshall, and of course, Jefferson famously hated John Marshall. And we know that, one of the most impactful Supreme Court decisions ever was Marbury versus Madison. So do we have a sense of Madison's relationship with John Marshall? Like, was it productive? Was it also antagonistic?
Well, they would have been allies at the Virginia Ratifying Convention in 1788. And then they get together again in the 1820s. Madison's last formal act as a politician would have been at the convention to write a new Constitution in the 1820s, Madison did not have a lot of occasion to interact with Marshall. Marshall comes into Congress. I think Madison is already retired by that point that Marshall comes into Congress, or Marshall's still very junior. So Marshall's career sort of takes off very quickly during the Adams administration, which is the period that Marshall is retired. But one of the things I really like about the story of Marbury versus Madison, it adds a lot of color, I think, to politics and how politics could be played with brass knuckles back then. Is, the story of Marbury versus Madison is extraordinary, right? That basically what happened is that the Federalists expand the judiciary, and Adams makes all of these appointments, and they get confirmed by the Senate. Most of the commissions, which is just basically a piece of paper saying, I'm allowed to be a judge, here are my credentials, right? Most of them get mailed, but a bunch of them are effectively, Madison walks in the first day of the job and there's a big stack of them laying on his desk, and he just throws them out, right? It's what he does. It's an extraordinary thing. I think it's really funny. Like the Marbury sues because Madison's like, yeah, I'm not giving you that. And Marbury can't be a justice of the peace without his credentials. It just goes to show, that's a pretty, that is some politics right there, And I just think it's really, and we sort of lose, and I think that's sort of an example of when we tell the story of the founders and we repeat it again and again, and we get more reverential, but we end up losing a lot of frankly, the grubby details a little bit, to be perfectly honest, but the grubby details are often the sort of the most interesting. I just think it's really funny that Madison and Jefferson they get this, well, we'll just throw those out. That's problem solved, It's just a very funny thing to me.
All right. I love that. Just trying to think of the modern equivalent of, the text that's new phone. Who's this? Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's exactly what they did to Marbury. They ghosted him.
Yeah. I love that. Okay. Well, as we're quickly running up against time, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to kind of where you think Madison's legacy is most evident as we sort of observe the political landscape today, because of course, in a lot of ways it's incredibly different, but where do you see that we still have hints of Madison in our daily existence?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that this is one of the challenges with appreciating Madison is that when you think about Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson was very smart about curating his legacy. You see it on his tombstone, right? The author of the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the founder of the University of Virginia. So here is why that's why I'm important. Madison's contributions, Madison doesn't write, the Constitution. We call him the father of the Constitution, but he would not have liked that. And it really, there are a lot of people at the convention, like a Gouverneur Morris, like a John Rutledge, like a James Wilson, who can say, excuse me. So what are Madison's contributions? I think that Madison's most durable, lasting contribution is in the expectations within the public mind that many of us are still Madisonian in a way. And I think there's a good way to sort of illustrate that, is again, to sort of return to Madison's refusal during the War of 1812 to enact any regulations against people who disagreed with him. And I think that speaks to his enduring contribution, is that I think all of us, most of us, 10%, 5 to 10% of the country is just crazy. So what are you going to do? I would say the overwhelming majority of Americans, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, moderate, whatever, are really deep in their bones believe that the only way for politics to work is if people are allowed to voice their opinions and to say what they think, and that the only way politics can work in the long haul is if differing views are ultimately reconciled with one another. That's how politics is supposed to function. I really think that the most consistent, clear-eyed exemplar of that idea during the founding era was James Madison. I really do. I mean, I think that there were people who were committed to it at times and expressed it in different ways, but I think Madison made the most consistent, forceful arguments, and I think that he believed in that even when it was inconvenient to him, like the Hartford Convention, which I think says something, such that if we were to find ourselves in a war today, I mean, God forbid, and the government were to pass something like the Sedition Act of 1798, I think the country would lose it. And I think that they would lose it in ways that if you go and read Madison's Virginia resolutions, which have been completely misunderstood, they would lose it in that way. Like they would make Madisonian arguments. And in other words, like a lot of things that are Madisonian about us that are under the surface are under the surface because it's just how we do things in this country. But if you go back and look at the 1790s, especially, it wasn't yet how we did things. Hamilton offered another vision of politics based on patronage. The Federalists as well, the suppression of dissent because it was deemed to be dangerous. There were alternative ways to go about doing politics, but these ways are defeated. And I think we're all the better that Madison, more than I would say anybody else, was integral in defeating them, even more than Jefferson. Because, I mean, if you look at Jefferson with his Kentucky resolutions, ends up, I think, doing more harm than good with the Kentucky resolutions by giving, a line to the nullifiers. But that's not what Madison is doing in the Virginia resolutions. Madison is saying, no, we need the states to speak up, right? The way we combat political suppression is to speak more loudly. I think that's a very American idea, but I think it's American in a distinctively Madisonian way.
That's terrific. Awesome. Well, Jay, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I mean, at Montpelier, we will geek out about Madison all day, every day. So this has been a lot of fun. And for those joining us, the new book is titled James Madison, America's First Politician. And the preceding book was called The Price of Greatness. So please, if you've not already read them, pick them up at either the museum shop or your nearest local retailer. And they make great Christmas gifts.
Yes, they do.
Thank you so much. And folks, we'll look forward to picking up our book talks on our Constitution 101s in January of 2022. So thank you all very much this evening. It's been a pleasure. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.